There's a kind of quiet you only hear in a house that's about to stop being yours. Maggie Doyle heard it on the night of December 22nd, standing in the middle of a living room she had swept 10,000 times, holding a folded piece of paper that weighed more than anything she owned. 3 days before Christmas, 2 kids asleep down the hall, and a notice in her hand that said she had until the 24th to be gone. She didn't cry. That surprised her a little. She'd cried over smaller things. Over a spilled gallon of milk she couldn't afford to replace. Over a school photo she had to say no to. But standing there, with the tree lights still blinking in the corner because she hadn't had the heart to unplug them yet, she felt something colder than tears. She felt invisible. Like the world had finally finished the job of forgetting she was there. What Maggie didn't know that night, what she couldn't have known, was that she was wrong about that. Dead wrong. She was about to learn that a person can be seen in ways they never imagined, by people they never suspected, for reasons that would take her completely apart in the best way a heart can come apart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You have to understand who this woman was first. Because if you met Maggie at the grocery store where she worked the register, you'd never look twice. 41 years old. Tired eyes she kept bright on purpose. A coat she'd patched at the elbow twice because a new one wasn't in the budget, and the budget was the only thing in her life that never lied to her. Her husband had been gone 4 years. Not dead. Just gone. The way some men leave early enough to dodge the hard part and late enough to leave the bills behind. So Maggie did what she always did. She carried it. 2 jobs, 2 kids. One small rented half of a duplex at the end of Birch Street, where the heat worked when it wanted to, and the landlord cashed the check on the first no matter what. And here's the thing about Maggie that nobody on that street knew yet. The thing that changes everything I'm about to tell you. This woman, who had almost nothing, who counted quarters in the dark so her kids wouldn't see her worry, was quietly the reason good things kept happening to other people on that block. Things nobody could explain. She made sure of that. She made very sure nobody could explain them. Because the one thing poverty had never managed to take from Maggie Doyle was the thing she was about to lose her home protecting. She just didn't know yet that somebody had been watching her do it. The first time it happened, old Walter Briggs thought he was dreaming. He was 78 that winter, 3 houses down from Maggie on the same side of Birch Street, living alone since his wife Eleanor passed. His kids called on Sundays from 2 states away and meant well and never came. Walter had a bad hip, a colder house than he'd admit to, and a way of going quiet for days at a time that nobody noticed because nobody was looking. Then one January night, he opened his front door to bring in the paper and nearly stepped on it, a mason jar, still warm. Chicken soup, the real kind, with the carrots cut thick the way Eleanor used to cut them. No note, no name, just steam rising off the lid into the freezing dark. He stood there in his slippers and looked up and down the empty street and saw nobody. He told himself it was a mistake, somebody's wrong porch. He ate it anyway, standing at the counter, and it was the first hot meal he'd had in 9 days that he didn't make himself. It happened again the next week, and the week after. Always on the cold nights, the ones that got down into a man's bones, and made him think dark thoughts about how long a person could go before anyone would know. The jar would appear, warm, wordless. And Walter, who had stopped believing the world remembered him, started leaving his porch light on, not to catch whoever it was, but just so they wouldn't slip on his step in the dark. He never did catch her. Not really, but one night near the end of February, he happened to be standing back from the window when a figure came up his walk, set the jar down soft as a prayer, and turned to go. The streetlight caught her for half a second. A patched coat at the elbow. A grocery store badge she'd forgotten to take off. Walter knew that coat. Everybody on Birch Street knew that coat. It belonged to the young mother at the end of the block, the one with the 2 little ones, the one who looked like she was holding the whole world up with 2 hands and a prayer of her own. And Walter, who had every reason to be the one getting help, sat down at his kitchen table and put his face in his hands, because he understood something in that moment that took his breath. That woman didn't have enough. He knew she didn't. The whole street knew she didn't. And she was spending what little she had on a lonely old man 3 doors down who couldn't do a single thing for her in return. He almost went out there, almost called her name, almost tried to press a few crumpled dollars into her hand, but something stopped him. The way she'd set that jar down. So careful. So quiet. Like the secret was the whole point. Like being thanked would ruin something she needed more than she needed the thanks. So Walter did the hardest thing a proud man can do. He let her think he didn't know. But he started writing it down. In the back of the same little notebook where he kept Eleanor's recipes, he wrote the date every time a jar appeared. He didn't know why exactly. He just felt, deep in his chest, that someday this would matter. that someday somebody would need to know exactly how many times that woman had chosen a stranger over herself. He had no idea how right he was. He had no idea he wasn't the only one on Birch Street keeping count. 3 doors the other direction, a family had just started keeping a list of their own. The Alvarez family found out in March, and they found out by accident. Carmen and Tony lived directly across the street from Maggie, close enough to wave, far enough to never really talk. Tony had been a foreman at the lumberyard for 11 years until the yard closed in October and took his paycheck and most of his pride with it. By winter they had 3 kids, no income, and a stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter that Carmen had stopped opening because she already knew what every one of them said. The electric bill was the one that scared her most. They were 2 months behind, and the shut-off notice had a date on it, and the date was in December, and December in their part of the country was no joke. Carmen lay awake doing the math that never worked. She didn't tell Tony how bad it was. He didn't tell her he already knew. That's how it goes in a house where 2 people are drowning and each one's holding their breath so the other won't hear. Then one afternoon, Carmen walked to the mailbox expecting another red-stamped envelope and found something else instead. A plain white one. No return address. Her name on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize, careful and a little slanted, the kind of writing that takes its time. Inside was a money order, made out to the power company, for exactly half of what they owed, and a single line on a torn piece of paper, no signature. So the kids stay warm. Merry early Christmas. Carmen stood at the mailbox and cried right there on the sidewalk, the kind of crying you do when relief and shame arrive at the exact same moment and you can't tell them apart. She had no idea who. She thought maybe the church. Maybe some program she'd applied to and forgotten. She brought it inside, and she and Tony sat over it for an hour and came up with nothing. Some good soul. Some stranger. That's what they decided. A miracle with no face. The face came in November, almost a year later, and again, it came by accident. Carmen was driving home late from the second cleaning job she'd taken to help dig them out, and she pulled up to the corner just in time to see a woman slip an envelope into the mailbox of the fam house 2 doors down. The same careful motion, glance left, glance right, gone. And under the streetlight, a coat with a patched elbow. Carmen sat in her parked car with the engine off and her hands frozen on the wheel, because she knew that coat. She'd waved at that coat 100 times, and she finally understood that the miracle with no face had a face after all, and it was the face of the woman at the end of the block who had even less than they did. She thought about marching over there, about throwing her arms around her, about finally saying thank you for the warmest winter her kids ever had. But she remembered that torn piece of paper. No signature. On purpose, and she understood, the way Walter had understood, that this woman gave the way some people pray. Privately, where being seen would break the spell of it. So Carmen kept the secret too, and that night, lying next to Tony, she finally told him. Not about their bills. About Maggie. About what that woman had quietly done for them, and for the fams, and God only knew who else on Birch Street. Tony was quiet for a long time in the dark. Then he said the thing that started everything. He said, "She's gonna need help one day." People like that always think they're the only ones strong enough to give it. And when her day comes, she's not gonna ask. So we'd better be paying attention. They started paying attention. They started quietly, putting a little aside. Not much. They didn't have much. But Carmen got an empty coffee can and pushed it to the back of the cupboard behind the flour, and every week she dropped in whatever she could, $1, sometimes 5, and she didn't tell Maggie, and she didn't tell anyone. What Carmen didn't know was that behind a different cupboard, in a different house on that same street, there was already another can just like it. And it was filling up faster than she could have guessed. It turned out half of Birch Street was keeping a secret, and not one of them knew about the others. The Fams had a coffee can. They'd figured it out the spring before the Alvarez family did, when their daughter got sick, and the urgent care bill landed like a brick, and an envelope showed up the next week with $200 and no name. Mr. Pham had seen the patched coat from his upstairs window. He'd said nothing. He'd started saving. The widow Doris on the corner had one tucked inside her sewing basket ever since the morning she woke to find her walk shoveled clean and salted before dawn, her car scraped, and a thermos of coffee left on her hood, on the worst week of the worst winter, the week after her husband's funeral, when she physically could not have done it herself and had told exactly no one. She'd watched the next storm from her window. She'd seen who came. A young couple in the blue house had one. Maggie had babysat their newborn through 3 nights of a terrifying fever so the mother could sleep before a surgery, and had refused, flatly refused, every dollar they tried to give her, and had said only, "Pay it forward someday, that's all," and gone home to her own kids and her own exhaustion. None of them had said anything to Maggie, and here's the strange and beautiful thing, the thing that still gets me when I think about it. None of them had said anything to each other, either. Each family on that street believed they were the only one who knew. Each family was quietly, privately, getting ready for a day they couldn't name, saving for a woman who had no idea she was being saved for. They were a rescue that didn't know it was a rescue yet. And then December came, and the day arrived, and it arrived in the cruelest possible way. It was Walter who saw the truck first, December 21st. A pickup in front of Maggie's place, and a man in a good coat hammering a sign into the frozen lawn. Walter put on his boots and walked down in the cold, his bad hip screaming, and read it. The duplex had been sold. New owner wanted it empty. The tenant had until Christmas Eve. Word moves differently on a street that has decided to keep a secret together. It moved house to house in the cold after dark. Carmen took the north end. Walter took the south, hip and all. They knocked on doors and they said the same careful thing each time. The woman at the end of the block is being put out 3 days before Christmas, and some of us have a reason to help her that we've never talked about out loud. And almost every single time, the door would open wider, and the face would change, and the person would go quiet for a second, and then say some version of the same impossible sentence. "You too?" The Fams brought their can. Doris brought her sewing basket envelope and a casserole dish she pressed into Carmen's hands like it was part of the plan. The Blue House couple brought what they had, and the baby Maggie had stayed up 3 nights to save, now a fat and laughing 1-year-old, and the mother cried when she heard, because she had never gotten to say thank you the way she meant it. But it wasn't enough. That was the gut punch they hit on the second night. All of them crowded into Carmen's small kitchen, counting it out on the table under the bad overhead light. Back rent. The deposit she'd need for somewhere new. First month somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere her kids could wake up on Christmas morning and still believe the world was a place that made sense. They counted it twice. It wasn't enough. It was a beautiful pile of crumpled, hard-won dollars from people who didn't have it to give, and it still came up short, and the room went quiet with the particular silence of good people running out of road. And here's what I want you to understand, because this is the part that matters more than the money. Not one person in that kitchen suggested giving up. Not one. These were people who knew exactly how much a half-paid electric bill could mean, who knew the weight of a warm jar on a cold step, who had each been pulled out of their own dark water by the same quiet pair of hands. They had learned something from Maggie that you can't teach with words. They had learned that you give what you have, and when what you have isn't enough, you don't stop. You go find more. That's the thing about a kindness done in secret. People think it disappears into the dark. It doesn't. It goes underground and it grows roots, and it comes up years later in places you'd never expect. In the cupboards of strangers, in a coffee can behind the flour, in an old man's notebook full of dates. Maggie thought every quiet thing she'd ever done had vanished unseen. Every single one of them had been planted. And now, in the worst week of her life, the whole garden was about to bloom at once, and she had no idea. It was Tony who said it. Tony who'd lost his job and his pride, and gotten both quietly handed back by a woman who'd asked for nothing. He looked at the pile of money that wasn't enough, and he said, "Then we go past this street." So they did. Carmen called the church, not for charity, but to ask if they could borrow the parking lot and a few tables. Doris knew the man who ran the diner on 5th, and the diner man knew Maggie. She'd covered a stranger's check there once, when a young dad's card got declined in front of his kids, and when Doris told him what was happening, he said, "Give me till tomorrow." The Blue House husband worked at the radio station, just the overnight board, nobody important, but he knew how to put 3 sentences on the air at 6 in the morning without using anyone's name. And the 3 sentences he wrote, that he read into the dark at dawn 2 days before Christmas, were these. There's a woman in this town who spent years quietly saving her neighbors, and most of them never knew it was her. Now she's about to lose everything, 3 days before Christmas, with 2 kids and too much pride to ask. If you've ever been the person nobody saw helping, you know exactly who I'm talking about, even if you've never met her. He didn't give an address. He didn't give a name. He just gave that. And all over a cold town 2 days before Christmas, people who had their own coffee cans, their own warm jars, their own miracles with no face, set down their coffee and went still and thought, I know exactly who that is. Maggie, meanwhile, packed in the dark. Alone. certain, to the bottom of her tired heart, that not one soul in the world had noticed she was there. She had never been so wrong about anything. 12 blocks away, in a part of town that had never heard of Birch Street, a man named Earl Hutchins was drinking his coffee in the dark when the radio said the thing that stopped his hand halfway to his mouth. Earl was 63. He drove a delivery route, had for 30 years, and he was the kind of man who kept the radio on low in the kitchen just to have a voice in the house since his wife passed. He wasn't really listening that morning. He was thinking about his route, about the ice on the overpass, about nothing. And then a young man's voice came through and said there was a woman in this town who'd spent years quietly saving her neighbors, and most of them never knew it was her, and now she was about to lose everything 3 days before Christmas, with 2 kids and too much pride to ask. And then the voice said the part that put Earl's coffee down on the counter. If you've ever been the person nobody saw helping, you know exactly who I'm talking about, even if you've never met her. Earl sat very still, because 40 years ago, Earl had been on the other side of that sentence, and he had never told a living soul. He'd been 23. Newly married, dead broke, behind on everything, the kind of young that thinks the hole only goes one direction. And one morning he'd come out to a car that wouldn't start, the car he needed to keep the only job that was keeping them afloat, and he'd stood in the cold knowing this was the thing that finally sank them. And a man he barely knew, an older fella from the end of the street whose name Earl never even got, had walked over without a word, looked under the hood, and quietly paid to have it fixed. Wouldn't take a dime back. Wouldn't take thanks. Just said, "Somebody did it for me once. Do it for somebody else someday." And then the man moved away that spring, and Earl never saw him again, and never got the chance to make it right. 40 years. Earl had carried that for 40 years. He tried to pay it forward in little ways, here and there, but the debt never quite felt closed, because the one person he owed was long gone, and he'd never even learned his name. And now a voice on the radio was describing somebody just like that man, somebody who gave in the dark and slipped away before the door opened, somebody about to go under who would never ask. Earl Hutchins, who had a delivery route to run and ice on the overpass, and every practical reason in the world to finish his coffee and go to work, got up from his kitchen table, went to the coffee can on top of the refrigerator where he kept his cash for the slow months, and took out everything in it. Then he called the station and asked the only question that mattered. Where? Where do I bring it? He wasn't the only one calling. That was the thing the radio man hadn't expected. The phone at the station started ringing before the sun was up, and it didn't stop. A nurse coming off a night shift. A widow. A teenager who'd emptied his game money jar. A contractor who said, "Put me down for whatever's still short. I'll cover the gap." None of them knew Maggie. Every one of them knew somebody like her, or had been kept alive once by a kindness they never got to repay, and here, finally, was an address for a debt they thought they'd carry to the grave. By mid-morning on Christmas Eve, the church parking lot had cars in it that didn't belong to anybody from Birch Street. People stood around folding tables in the cold, strangers to each other, holding coffee cans and envelopes and folded bills, and they kept saying the same thing, the way the neighbors had said it, the way it travels. Somebody did this for me once. I never got to pay it back. Earl drove over with the overpass, still iced, and his route still waiting, and didn't care. He put 40 years of unpaid debt into a shoebox for a woman he'd never met. And then, because he couldn't help himself, because some things you have to see, he asked which street. And he got in his car, and he drove toward Birch Street, to a house that wasn't his, to stand witness for a stranger who reminded him of the only man who ever saved him. And Maggie, 12 blocks away, turned off her tree lights and went to bed certain she was the loneliest woman in the world. She had an army coming. She just didn't know it yet. Maggie spent the 23rd doing the math of disappearing. It's a specific kind of math, and if you've ever done it, you know, how many boxes, how many trips, what you keep and what you leave because it won't fit in a car and there's no room in wherever you're going, which in her case was nowhere yet, which is a word that sits in your stomach like a stone. She'd called every place she could think of. The shelter was full through the new year. Her sister 300 miles away said come, but said it in the voice that meant please don't, because her sister was drowning too. So Maggie packed. And she did the thing mothers do, the thing that costs more than anyone watching could ever guess. She made it a game for the kids. She told 7-year-old Lily and 5-year-old Sam that they were going on an adventure, that they got to choose just their very favorite things, that it would be fun, like camping. Lily, who was 7, and therefore no longer entirely fooled, watched her mother's face the way kids do when they're deciding whether to believe a thing they need to be true, and she chose to believe it. For her mother's sake, she chose it. That's its own kind of love, and it nearly finished Maggie off, watching her little girl pretend right back at her. The hardest moment came that night. Lily, in the dark, in the half-empty room, asked the question Maggie had been bracing for since the notice came. "Mom, if we move, how is Santa gonna know where to find us?" And Maggie, who had not cried through the eviction notice or the phone calls or the boxes, sat down on the edge of her daughter's bed and held it together by a thread she could feel snapping. She said Santa always knows. She said Santa finds every kid, no matter what. She said it with everything she had, and she did not believe a single word of it, and she stayed in that room until both kids were asleep so they wouldn't see her face come apart in the dark. Then she went out to the living room, to the tree she still hadn't taken down, and she let herself fall apart all the way, just once, just for a few minutes, the way you can only do when no one can see you. She thought about the years, about every jar of soup, every envelope, every shoveled walk, every dollar she'd given away that she could have kept. She didn't regret a single one of them, even now, even broke and evicted and out of road. But she let herself wonder, just for a second, in the rawest, most human way, whether any of it had mattered. Whether anyone had even noticed. Whether a person could pour themselves out their whole life and have it all just soak into the ground and vanish like it was never there. What she didn't know, sitting on that floor with the lights blinking, was that 12 blocks away the church parking lot was filling up with folding tables. That Walter was up past midnight with his recipe notebook open, copying out 3 years of dates onto a clean sheet of paper for a reason he couldn't fully explain yet. That the diner man had cooked all day. That somewhere a coffee can behind somebody's flour was getting emptied into a shoebox, and the shoebox was getting heavy. She didn't know that the radio man's 3 sentences had done something nobody expected. That the station had gotten calls all day, people asking how, where, who do I give it to. That a town full of strangers, each one carrying their own quiet debt to kindness, had heard one woman's nameless story and recognized their own. She didn't know that being unseen and being forgotten are not the same thing. That she had been the first one all along, but never the only one. That every secret good she'd ever done had been a seed, and that the whole street, the whole town almost, had been quietly growing the harvest she was about to walk straight into. She knew none of it. She turned off the tree lights. She went to bed in a house that wasn't hers anymore, beside 2 sleeping kids, certain it was the loneliest night of her life. It was the last lonely night she would ever have on Birch Street. Because the next night was Christmas Eve, and Christmas Eve was when they were coming. Christmas Eve came up cold and clear and blew over Birch Street, the kind of cold that makes the snow squeak underfoot and the stars look close enough to touch. Maggie woke up early because she'd barely slept. The plan, what little of it there was simple and brutal. Load the car. Take the kids to the diner for one last warm breakfast she'd been quietly saving for, because no child of hers was going to remember Christmas Eve as the morning they were hungry. Then drive, and figure out the rest from a parking lot somewhere, the way she'd figured out everything else, alone. She got the kids up. She kept her voice bright. "Adventure Day," she said. Lily gave her that look again, the believing on purpose look, and held her little brother's hand. But when Maggie opened the front door to start carrying boxes to the car, she stopped. There was a wreath on her door, a real one, fresh pine, with a red ribbon. It had not been there the night before. She stood there holding a box, staring at it, and that's when she noticed the walk. Her walk, which should have been buried under 2 days of snow, was shoveled clean, salted. And there was a thermos sitting on her step, steam curling off it into the cold, and a folded note tucked under it. She set the box down. She picked up the note. Her hands weren't quite steady. She'd left 100 notes like this on other people's steps. She had never once received one. The note said, in handwriting she didn't know, "Don't load the car yet. Please, just trust us for 1 more hour. You've earned it more than anyone we know." Maggie read it 3 times. She did not understand. Trust who? She looked up and down Birch Street, the way Walter had looked, the way Carmen had looked, all those nights, searching the empty quiet for a face. And for the first time, the street looked back. Because doors were opening, up and down the block, in the blue cold of Christmas Eve morning, doors were opening, and people were coming out onto their porches. The Fams, Doris in her good coat, the Blue House couple with the baby bundled up like a little dumpling, Tony and Carmen and their 3 kids, and down at the south end, walking slow on a bad hip but walking, an old man she half recognized as the quiet widower from down the block, holding what looked like an old notebook against his chest. They came down off their porches, they came down the street, and they came toward her house, all of them, and Maggie stood frozen on her own front step, with a thermos warming her hands, and absolutely no idea what was happening. It was Walter who reached her first. He stopped at the bottom of her steps, this old man with watery eyes and a notebook, and he looked at her like she was something holy, and when he tried to speak his voice broke clean in half. He held up the notebook. He opened it to a page covered in dates, 3 years of dates, in careful old man handwriting. 41, he said. 41 nights, Maggie. That's how many times you left soup on my step thinking I was asleep. I counted every one. I wrote down every single one. I never said thank you because I could see you didn't want me to. He stopped. He pressed his lips together. But you're not leaving this street thinking nobody saw you. I won't allow it. I'm too old to allow it. Maggie's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She looked from Walter's face to the notebook to the crowd of neighbors gathering quiet in the snow behind him, every one of them watching her, and she felt the ground of everything she believed about herself begin to move. I don't, she started. I don't understand. How do you? And then Carmen stepped forward, with an envelope in her hand and a year of gratitude in her eyes, and said the words that began to take Maggie Doyle completely apart. You paid half our electric bill, Maggie. The winter Tony lost his job. You saved our kids from a cold house and you never let us know it was you. Her voice shook. Did you really think we'd just let you disappear? One by one, they came forward. And one by one, the secret Maggie had spent years keeping was handed back to her, in pieces, by the people she'd kept it from. The Blue House mother came up the steps with the baby on her hip. 3 nights, she said. You sat up 3 nights with her when she was burning with fever, so I could sleep before my surgery. You wouldn't take $1. You said pay it forward someday. She was crying now and not bothering to hide it. Today's someday, Maggie. Today's the day. Doris came next, the widow from the corner, who didn't say much because she'd never been one for words. She just took Maggie's cold hand in both of hers and said, You shoveled my walk the week I buried my husband. I watched you from the window. I was too broken to even open the door and thank you. She squeezed. I have wanted to thank you for 2 years. So, thank you. And on it went. The FAMs, for the urgent care bill. The diner had a story. People Maggie barely knew. People she'd helped so quietly she'd half forgotten it herself. A check covered here. A tank of gas there. A bag of groceries left on a porch. Each one stepped up and named the things she'd done in the dark and dragged it gently out into the light. And with every one, Maggie shook her head harder because this was not how it was supposed to work. She was the one who gave. She had built her whole battered life around being the one who gave. Being on this side of it, being seen, being thanked, being loved out loud in the snow, it undid something in her she didn't know how to put back. Stop, she finally said, and it came out as barely a whisper. Please, I can't, you don't have to, I didn't do those things so you'd... We know, Walter said gently. That's exactly why we're here. You did them for nothing, so we're doing this for nothing too. That's how it works. You taught us that. Every one of us. You just never knew you were teaching. And then Tony stepped forward, the big man who'd lost his job and his pride, holding a shoebox in his 2 hands like it was made of glass. He set it down on the step in front of Maggie. And he said, Open it. She knelt down in the snow in front of her own door, with 2 kids peeking out from behind her and a whole street standing witness, and she lifted the lid. It was money. Crumpled, folded, hard-won money. 1s and 5s and 10s. The kind of money that comes out of coffee cans and sewing baskets. The kind that people who don't have it scrape together anyway. And tucked on top, a piece of paper with a number written on it. The number was the back rent. And the deposit. And first month somewhere new, somewhere warm. It was all there. Every dollar. And then some. Maggie looked up from the box, and her face was wet, and her voice was gone, and she managed only one word. How? Some of it's us, Carmen said, gesturing to the street. Your neighbors, the people you've been quietly carrying for years. She paused. But a lot of it isn't, Maggie. A lot of it is people you've never met. Maggie didn't understand. Carmen saw she didn't understand. So she explained the radio. The 3 sentences. The story with no name and no address. Read into the dark 2 mornings ago. How the calls had started before the sun was even up. How strangers had driven across town to a church parking lot to put cash in a box for a woman they'd never seen, because the story of her had sounded exactly like the quiet good somebody had once done for them. "You're not just the woman who helped this street," Carmen said. "You're the woman who reminded a whole town what it feels like to be saved by somebody who never asked for credit. They heard you. They all heard you. They just wanted to give it back." And that's when Maggie noticed the cars. She'd been so locked on the faces in front of her that she hadn't seen them. The street was lined with them now, idling soft in the cold, headlights gold in the morning blue. Strangers behind every wheel. People she had never met, who had gotten up on Christmas Eve and driven to a street that wasn't theirs, to stand witness for a woman whose name half of them still didn't know. They had come to see the person from the radio, the one who gave when no one was watching. And now everyone was watching. There's a thing that happens to a person who has spent years being strong for everyone else. In the exact moment they're finally allowed to stop. It doesn't look like relief. It looks like collapse. Maggie knelt there in the snow with the shoebox in her lap, and the whole street and half a town of strangers standing around her, and the strength that had held her up through 4 years of carrying everything alone simply set itself down. She put her hand over her mouth, and she wept. The real kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere underneath the place where you keep your composure, and not one person looked away, and not one person told her to stop. Lily came out from behind the doorframe, 7 years old, in her coat, watching her mother cry in front of a crowd of people. And here is the thing about that little girl who had spent the last 3 days believing on purpose, holding up her end of a pretend so her mother wouldn't break. She walked down the steps, and she stood next to Maggie, and she looked out at all those faces, all those strangers, all those neighbors, and she asked the only question that made sense to her. "Mommy, did you do something good?" And it was old Walter who answered her, because Maggie couldn't. He got down as far as his bad hip would let him, until he was almost level with the little girl, and he said, "Your mama did the goodest thing a person can do, sweetheart. She helped people when she thought nobody would ever know, for years and years. And the thing about that kind of good..." He had to stop. He had to gather himself. The thing about that kind of good is it doesn't disappear. It waits. And then one day, when you need it most, it all comes home at once. He gestured out at the street, at the neighbors, at the strangers in their idling cars. "This is your mama's good, honey. All of this. This is every kind thing she ever did, coming home." Lily looked out at the crowd. Then she looked at her mother, seeing her, maybe for the first time, not as just mom, but as a person who had been quietly, secretly remarkable this whole time. And the little girl wrapped both arms around her mother's neck and held on. That's when Sam, 5 years old, who had been watching all of this from the doorway with enormous eyes, said the thing that finished off every adult standing there. He toddled out, looked up at the strangers and the lights and the wreath on the door, and he said, "Mommy, is this Santa? Did Santa find us?" And Maggie, who 2 nights ago had promised her daughter through her own breaking heart that Santa always knows, that Santa finds every kid no matter what, Maggie made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, and she pulled both her children in against her in the snow. She didn't answer him. She couldn't. But Carmen crouched down next to Sam, this little boy who'd asked if Santa had come, and she said, soft, "Yeah, buddy. Yeah. Something like that. He found you. He was never gonna miss you." The diner man stepped forward then and cleared his throat, embarrassed and gruff the way men get when they're feeling too much. He said breakfast was on him, all of them, right now, the whole street. He'd opened up special, and the griddle was hot. And Doris said there'd be a Christmas, a real one. She'd already talked to people. There were presents coming for those kids if she had to wrap them herself tonight. And the Blue House husband, the radio man, said quietly that the new landlord had heard the story too, had heard the whole town heard it, and had called the station that morning to say maybe an empty house on Christmas was a mistake. Maybe they could talk. Piece by piece, in the cold, on Christmas Eve, the disappearing that Maggie had been so certain of came apart in her hands and rearranged itself into something she had no idea how to hold. A home. A Christmas. A street full of people who knew her name now, all of them, and said it like it meant something. She stood up, finally, with a kid on each side of her, and she looked at Walter, at Carmen, at all of them, and she tried to find words big enough, and there weren't any. So she said the only thing there was, "I never wanted anyone to know." And Walter smiled, this old, broken, beautiful smile, and said, "We know, that's how we knew it was real." If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day, because stories like this one, the quiet ones, the true-hearted ones, are the whole reason this place exists, and there's a moment coming at the end of Maggie's story that I think you're going to carry with you. So stay with me. We're almost home. Maggie got her Christmas. The neighbors crowded into the diner that morning and ate pancakes until the windows fogged. Kids and old folks and strangers all mixed together at tables, shoved into one long line, and it was the loudest, warmest Christmas Eve breakfast that town had seen in years. The landlord did call. They did talk. Maggie stayed on Birch Street, in the little duplex at the end, with new locks and a paid-up lease, and a wreath on the door that she never did take down, not all winter. Santa found Lily and Sam. Doris and 3 other women stayed up half that night wrapping, and on Christmas morning there were presents under a tree that 2 nights before had blinked over a half-empty room. Lily got the one thing she'd asked for and stopped asking for when the boxes came out. Sam got a fire truck and never put it down. And Maggie sat on the floor with her kids in the gray morning light and watched them tear into a Christmas she had been certain, just 72 hours earlier, would never come. But that's not the part I want to leave you with. The part I want to leave you with is what Maggie did the next winter. Because the following December, on a cold night with the snow squeaking underfoot, an old man 3 doors down opened his front door to bring in the paper and nearly stepped on something. A mason jar. Still warm. And next to it, a second one, left by a different hand. And down the street, on the Alvarez porch, an envelope. And on the blue house's step, a thermos. The street had learned. That's what she'd done, without ever meaning to. She'd thought she was just one woman giving away soup in the dark. What she'd really been doing, all those years, was teaching an entire neighborhood how to see each other, how to give without being asked, how to keep a quiet count of someone's goodness and wait for the day you could hand it back. Maggie never stopped giving. She just wasn't the only one anymore. And the warm jars on cold steps kept appearing up and down Birch Street for years after that, from a dozen different hands, and no one ever signed them, because that was the whole point. And everyone on that street understood the point now. She had taught it to them, with nothing but soup and silence and a patched coat at the elbow. I think about that street sometimes. I think about all the good that gets done in this world that nobody sees. The shoveled walk, the covered check, the light left on so a stranger won't slip in the dark. We do these things, and we tell ourselves they vanish, that they soak into the ground and disappear, that nobody noticed and nobody ever will. Maggie believed that too, for years. And she was wrong. Every single seed she planted in the dark was growing the whole time, in cupboards and sewing baskets and an old man's notebook, waiting for the one night she'd need the harvest. Nothing good is ever really lost. It just goes quiet for a while, and it comes home when you least expect it and need it most. So here's what I'll leave you with, and then I'll let you go. The people who change the world the most are almost never the ones who get watched doing it. They're the ones leaving the jar on the step and walking away before the door opens. And if that's you, if you're the one nobody sees helping, the one keeping the quiet count, the one giving from a coffee can behind the flour, I need you to hear something tonight. You are not invisible. You were never invisible. Somebody saw. Somebody always sees. And one cold night, when you least expect it, the whole street is going to show up on your steps. If this story moved you, do me a favor and subscribe, so you don't miss the next one, and then leave me a comment and tell me this. Tell me about the quietest good thing someone once did for you, the kind they never asked credit for. I read them. I read all of them. And the ones you leave become the stories we tell next. Take care of each other out there. Leave the porch light on. We'll see you in the next one.